Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first talk of our lunchtime lecture series in 2023, and Happy New Year. This is an annual series of interesting and scholarly talks presented jointly with Public Programming and the Beckman Center for the History of Chemistry. My name is Mariel Carr. I'm the manager of video and podcast production at the Science History Institute, and it's my honor today to introduce our speaker, Deirdre Cooper Owens. Before I do, though, I'll say just a little bit about the format of our series. Deirdre will speak for about 30 minutes, and then there will be a Q&A. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the chat of StreamYard. Just make sure you're signed into your Google account. And you can also email your questions to us at lunchtimelectures@sciencehistory.org. So now to introduce today's speaker. Deirdre Cooper Owens is a historian of medicine working at the intersection of science, race, and gender. She's the Charles and Linda Wilson Professor in the History of Medicine and Director of the Humanities in Medicine program at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, as well as a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. She also serves as director of the Program in African American History at the Library Company of Philadelphia, which is the oldest cultural institution in the United States. And her first book, Medical Bondage, Race, Gender, and the Origins of American Gynecology, won the 2018 Darlene Clark Hine Book Award in African American Women's and Gender History. I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Cooper Owens several months ago for our upcoming podcast season, Innate: How Science Invented the Myth of Race, which launches on February 7th, and I'm delighted that she's back here again today. So welcome, Deirdre, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here. I'm really sorry that I'm not in the beautiful city of Philadelphia, but I bring you greetings from snowy Lincoln, Nebraska. So I'm going to get started because the hardest thing for me is to speak about this subject quickly, and 30 minutes for me is pretty quick. So I'm going to get to it. Let me, as I'm pulling up the screen, let me thank all of you for joining me virtually. Please send your questions in the chat section. I am more than happy to answer them and to engage with you. So why the history of medicine matters in birthing justice. I think like every scholar, particularly when I was finishing grad school, I thought maybe 10 people in my family would read the book, probably 2 or 3 good friends, because I was writing about dead people who lived in the late 18th and 19th century and who in the 21st century was interested. But something happened around 2017, the book's publication, 2017, 2018. All of a sudden, I started to hear more outcries around the issue of reproductive justice, right? This had been ongoing for decades, but it really reached a crescendo in terms of the outcries and the outrage because of the really dismal statistics concerning Black women and birthing people and maternal mortality and morbidity, and also infant mortality and morbidity for Black people who give birth. And all of a sudden, I was kind of catapulted into this space where people were seeking answers and they wanted the historical gaps to be filled. And so I was, I wasn't prepared, but I was actually happy about it. Not happy about the statistics, obviously, but really happy that there was this need and really this urgency around the importance of history and what we do, which is provide context. And so fast forward a few years, all of a sudden, the medical organizations, right, are now really interested in this topic. And so the journal for the AMA, the American Medical Association, wanted to devote on their podcast series a conversation around medical racism. And so here you had the deputy editor, now former deputy editor of that journal, Dr. Ed Livingston, and also another New York-based physician. And they were talking about medical racism, but this is what JAMA tweets out to promote a podcast on medical racism. No physician is racist. So how can there be structural racism in healthcare? And it wasn't actually, a provocation. It wasn't hyperbole. This is what the podcast speaker said. And so the controversy began when Dr. Ed Livingston, a deputy editor, said on February 24th last year that structural racism no longer existed in the US. In fact, the direct quote is, "Structural racism is an unfortunate term. Personally, I think taking racism out of the conversation will help. Many people like myself are offended by the implication that we are somehow racist." And so you're dedicating a show on medical racism, but you're saying medical racism doesn't exist, although all of the statistics show that, in fact, many healthcare practitioners and clinicians hold anti-Black beliefs, right? Now, that's not hyperbole. These are the statistics that are out here. And so, as you can imagine, kind of Twitter went, they went off. Historians, academic Twitter went off. And here I was, once again, trying to put the pieces of this historical puzzle together, right? To say that these things don't happen in a vacuum and they have a much longer history. And so it was very easy for me, and this is unfortunate, but really easy for me to pull statistics. And so one of the most well-known ones, I mean, at this point, I would say it's probably pretty famous, had been conducted, not in the 18th century, or the 19th century, or even the 20th century, conducted in the 21st century by Kelly Hoffman, who was then a doctoral candidate at the University of Virginia in the Department of Psychology. She was really interested in this topic of medical racism. And so she presents a study that has almost 300 people, largely residents from UVA's medical school. And her research revealed quite a number of things, right? But what was more shocking for me as a professor who's been, doing this for quite some time, was a number of the white medical students and even some of, residents, and even some of the faculty members held false beliefs about biological differences between Black people and white people, right? Their beliefs predict racial bias and pain perception and treatment. What was more surprising to me, right? I mean, there were beliefs that Black people had thicker skin and that somehow Black people age faster, that if Black people experience painful conditions like kidney stones or even childbirth, that the pain was not as great, or either they were histrionic and simply wanted drugs, right, or narcotics. Two of the residents who were interviewed by Hoffman and her team believe Black people were born with thicker skin. Born with tails. And you heard me. Two of them at the University of Virginia's medical school believe Black people were born with tails. This is in 2016, right? The information was collected in 2014, the article published in 2016. And so what's interesting for me is the fact that UVA is one of the nation's top ranked universities, right? Founded by Thomas Jefferson. I did my postdoc there, so I'm not beating up on UVA. I have a connection to it. And I know it is a really difficult school to gain admission, right? And so these are students who are coming in who already have a 4-year degree. What we know is that you can't find a science textbook. You certainly are not going to be able to find a monograph written by someone in the humanities or social science that says race is a biological construct. We know that there are no biological differences between Black people and white people, right? We know that Black people don't have thicker skin. And yet these are beliefs that were held by these medical residents, right? Which meant that they had already taken a Hippocratic oath to do no harm. But how do you take care of patients when you believe that these patients who are Black are different kinds of human beings, right? And the sad part of it is it echoed so closely some of the beliefs that were held by antebellum physicians. And so I take you to, some would say, the infamous Sam Cartwright. For historians of science and medicine, he's a pretty well-known name because he made some claims that were fairly surprising, even for the antebellum era. And there was a lot of controversy and attention given to those claims. But Sam Cartwright was asked by the Louisiana State Medical Association to write an article about the alleged differences between the Negro race and the white race. And all of the Negroes, I'm using the historical term that was used in the 1800s, all of the Negroes that he examined were enslaved, by the way. So Louisiana State Medical Association asks Cartwright to conduct this research, and he publishes an article based on his findings. And just like those group of UVA medical residents, he found that Black people, in fact, were biologically distinctive from white people, that Black people had all kinds of distinctive diseases. And the most famous disease was drapetomania. And drapetomania was a disease, a disease that caused lunacy, right, or insanity, that caused an enslaved person to run away or harbor the thought of running away. There were other distinctive diseases like rascality. So if you were sassy or you didn't pay attention to your orders, or dirt eating, I mean, all of those kinds of things, right? But what is most important for me as a historian of slavery, as a historian of medicine, but also seeing the ways that slavery and medicine have these political interconnections, is the work that Cartwright did in the 1850s using the spirometer. Now, he didn't create the spirometer, but he helps to develop the spirometer. And the spirometer was an instrument that was used to assess lung capacity. And if you look to, I'm going to point to my right here, it might be on your left, the way that you're looking at the screen, but you'll see a cover of a book by a dear colleague of mine, Lundy Braun, recently retired medical anthropologist from Brown University, who wrote a great book, Breathing Race into the Machine, about the spirometer, right? Inanimate object. And yet this inanimate object, ever since the 19th century, has been used to predict these kinds of racialized claims about Black bodies and white bodies. So Cartwright uses the spirometer to assess the lung capacity of both white people and Black people. And unsurprisingly, guess what he finds? For these Black people, i.e. all enslaved, he found that they had a lessened lung capacity. And so this really worked to help prove for Cartwright, see, these people are not a superior race, that they have a lot of biological deficiencies, right? Not just that they're prone to mental illness, but they also have diminished lung capacity. But lest we think he was exceptional here, he was already borrowing from a practice and a literature, a set of ideologies that had already existed. In 1804, when Thomas Jefferson publishes his only book, Notes on the State of Virginia, he writes about this diminished lung capacity of the Negro race. In 1799, in front of the American Philosophical Society, Benjamin Rush, the father of American medicine, a founding father, right? He declares that, in fact, the Negro has lessened lung capacity. So Cartwright was also pulling on existing ideologies around the kind of genetic makeup of Black people. And to this day, much like Kelly Hoffman's statistics have shown, the spirometer has been used by physicians and clinicians in a racialized way, which is quite odd because it's not like there's a Black lung and a white lung. And yet, whenever a Black person and a white person's readings are the same on a spirometer, there's literally a dial that a clinician can use that can change the reading for the Black person. There's no reason to do it other than this kind of old history that stems from, the antebellum era. And yet those practices are still being used in the 21st century. So where does that leave us, those who are interested in history, those who are interested in trying to make sense of all of these damning statistics, right? All of this information that a lot of people just don't have access to, and they're hearing things that might be factual, some things that aren't. And so for me, it really stemmed down to, how do I, as a historian of slavery, of women's history, of medicine, make sense of this, especially for a lay audience who was really hungry for these kinds of conversations, and they wanted to have nuanced conversations about how we arrived at this place, right, as a nation in a birthing crisis. And so a part of what I wanted to dismantle was this exceptionality narrative. And trust me, I worked at a library company, right? The oldest cultural institute, founded in 1731. It has probably propagated in its past these exceptionality narratives about exceptional people kind of pioneering and doing these things and not realizing that much of what was going on, people were building upon things that already existed, right? Upon information, upon developments, upon institutions that had already existed. So part of what I was trying to dismantle, but also grapple with and interrogate, was this notion of pioneering gynecologists as exceptionally cruel, exceptionally mean-spirited, exceptionally racist against enslaved people. And so a part of what I was really trying to speak against, right, or at least help to nuance and massage so that it could be a bit more accurate, were these kinds of headlines, right? Lawrence Saucer, great investigative journalist, writing for South Carolina's Post and Courier about Dr. James Marion Sims. He's most famously known as the father of American gynecology. And he has become a lightning rod when we have these kinds of conversations around the Black birthing crisis. People have attributed all kinds of things to Sims. Some are factual, others are not. But, you know, a part of this is the kind of binary positioning of Sims. Was he a savior of women or a medical monster? And I'm saying, wait, it's a bit more complicated. That, in fact, Sims wasn't very exceptional at all, right? The thing that Sims gets right is the surgical reparative method to repair the holes that had formed in the upper vaginal area after a very difficult childbirth. And in fact, that reparative method is still being used to this day. He was great at that, right? He was also a prolific medical writer. He published a lot of articles. A lot of MDs during the time didn't do that. But Sims wasn't exceptional in the ways that he treated enslaved people, right? And so a part of this too has been really difficult. If you all haven't noticed, I'm Black. I'm just saying, right? I'm Black. This is not just a tan. So when I'm confronting people who look like me about Sims's exceptional abuse, it can become a bit tricky, because then I might be read as a defender of Sims. And I'm like, Sims is dead. He doesn't need me to defend him, right? But what I think is most important, if we want to center the narratives and the experiences of the enslaved women who also contributed to this medical branch, and I'll share that a bit later, is to actually have facts. So was Sims someone who intentionally mutilated the reproductive parts of enslaved women? He wasn't. And let me tell you, Sims was a slave-owning physician. When Sims leased the 6 to 9, actually, it's about 8 to 9 women that we know. But when he leased those women to perform experimental surgeries on them for their obstetrical fistula, a condition that's created after a prolonged and protracted childbirth that creates some tearing and holes in the upper vaginal area where incontinence is the result. When he leases those women from their owners, the one thing he knows as a slave-owning physician who lives in Alabama is that you want to actually repair the reproductive organs of enslaved women, because that's how the institution of 19th century slavery is not just maintained, but propagated, right? Enslaved women pass on their enslaved status to the children that they bear. Was Sims intentionally drugging these women and giving them opiates to make them addicts? That's another thing I've heard. And I'm like, no. Sims gave people opiate-derived medicines because he was doing surgery in the upper vaginal area. Guess what you don't want to happen is you suture that organ. What you don't want to happen is tearing due to bowel movements. And so opiates cause constipation. On the other side, for those who are the Sims defenders, right? They say, oh, but he took these women in at cost in his own hospital and home. He was a compassionate, yes, he was a slave owner, but he was compassionate. I'm like, no, he was a businessman, right? And he leased these women in the same ways that we lease cars and apartments, and even our own labor if we work for temp agencies or as substitute teachers. That was a common 19th century practice. It was so common that many famous formerly enslaved people like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman talk about being leased when they were children. Harriet Tubman was first leased at 6 years old. So there was nothing compassionate or benevolent about this behavior. He was essentially doing what existed, right? Now, the first chapter of my book, I literally give an intellectual genealogy of the ways that Sims is inheriting these practices from other men who did this kind of work. From Georges Cuvier, French-born natural historian, who does work on Saartjie Baartman, derisively known as the Hottentot Venus. She was a South African-born enslaved woman, sold to Englishmen, later sold to a Frenchman. Cuvier, who's at the National Museum of Paris, gets a hold of Baartman. Unfortunately, she dies in his care, and he is moved to find out whether this South African-born so-called Hottentot woman is an actual human being, or is she a missing link between humans and primates? And so he performs an autopsy. You can see a picture of her skeleton. Guess what? Normal human skeleton. He wanted to know whether she had a Hottentot labia. Was her labia different than other women? It wasn't. So after she dies, once he performs that autopsy, he excises her genitalia, puts it in a jar, right? Preserves it, puts it in a jar, right? Displays her skeleton, does the same thing with her brain, finds that she's just like any other human being. But what he sets up and helps to set up is the ways that scientists and doctors start to write about and treat formerly enslaved people after death, right? Saidiya Hartman, the MacArthur Genius winner, popularized a term called the afterlife of slavery. And so he really sets the tone across the Atlantic world in terms of how people are also treating the actual remains of those who were formerly enslaved, right? So that there is worth, even in the afterlife of slavery, for what Black people's body parts, right, and remains can teach scientists and medical practitioners. Ephraim McDowell, father of the ovariotomy, first performs the pioneering surgery on a white woman, and she lives. It's considered the first successful abdominal-based surgery in the Western world. He does so in 1809, 1 year after the Constitution bans the transatlantic slave trade. And this is the really interesting thing. In order for McDowell, who lived in Kentucky at the time, to perfect this experimental surgery, he finds 5 negresses and he performs experimental surgeries on them over a span of almost 10 years, one of them even dying, right? So once again, here you have a slave-owning physician doing this kind of experimental work in what later becomes gynecology. Dr. Francois M. Prévost, he is considered, even though this historical marker says he's the first, he was actually the second. He performs 2 successful cesarean sections on enslaved women. He had done the experimental work prior in Haiti, right? He was also French-born. After the Haitian Revolution is about to kick off, he moves to Louisiana, another former French colony, now a part of the United States, performs this experimental surgery. The unbroken link from the 1830s, when he performs these surgeries, once again, the historical marker has some of the dates wrong. From the 1830s, when Prévost performs these surgeries, Louisiana remained from that time until this time, until the 21st century, it was the #1 state that disproportionately relied on Black bodies for C-sections more than any other state until Mississippi knocked it down to #2 less than 5 years ago. And might I remind you, Mississippi is the state that has the largest Black population, right? Once again, where's the exceptionality in this? And then John Peter Matara, he founds Randolph-Macon Medical College, no longer in existence, another slave-owning physician. He pioneers the obstetrical fistula surgery that Sims made popular through his reparative method. His experimental research is on an enslaved woman and a white woman. The white woman is quote unquote cured. The enslaved woman isn't. He blames the enslaved woman for having sex. And so after years and years and years of repeated surgeries, she's unable to be cured because, so, according to Matara, she's too promiscuous, right? And what we do know about enslaved women, they don't own their bodies, right? She doesn't own her body where she can tell him to stop the surgeries. She certainly doesn't own her body to stop having sexual intercourse during the surgeries, right? So these are the ways where I'm saying when we talk about these exceptional historical actors, we also have to be mindful, right, that they're not operating in vacuums, but that this is a part of a structure and a system, right, that had already been in place. All of these men who I kind of name in what I call the roots section, right? If you all are old enough to remember the 1977 TV miniseries that Alex Haley popularized because of his book Roots. But this is the Roots section. And what I wanted to do was to show that we don't assign blame, right, to one person, but what we're talking about is a structure that has created an institution, right, that has us in a real chokehold around the birthing crisis, right? And then, of course, there's James Marion Sims, who I spoke about before. We can see his hospital in Montgomery, where he originally starts. His research is below. So it's a picture. There are two pictures. So the one below is where he starts the experimental work on enslaved women in Mount Meigs. But he does the pioneering surgeries in the hospital in the more urban Montgomery, Alabama. And that site is still standing to this day. The legacy, right? He literally perfects, the Sims speculum. So of course there were already speculums that were being used by doctors, but what Sims does, because of his experimental work on these enslaved women, he creates a bipod speculum where you can see, right, the cervix. You can see it better. That's still being used today. The speculum is still referred to as a Sims speculum. He also uses a surgical technique that's based on a lithotomy position. And he essentially has the patient on their hands and knees where he performs the surgery. But what is interesting for me, Sims was always very transparent in his memoirs, but also his medical writings, that he used enslaved people. And that also when his two white male surgical assistants quit because he kept failing, right? He wasn't successful in this reparative surgical method. He had to train these enslaved patients who then served as his nurses and surgical assistants. I often joke that's when he finally got the surgical reparative method right? When he had the enslaved women assisting him, who were illiterate, by the way. But that's a whole other conversation that we can talk about in terms of the racial cognitive dissonance, right? Black people and women are supposed to be, inferior human specimens, and yet, they are relied upon for their thinking, for their know-how. But what's interesting is, even though Sims had always been transparent about who his patients were, look at the commemorative journal articles. All of a sudden, the patient is white, the nurse is white, because of, the ways that people think about the moral implications of a man touching a naked or partially nude woman. Sims is almost guiding the nurse, right? Where he's just holding the patient and the nurse is inserting the object, right? And so there's this erasure, right, that happens from the historical record, where all of a sudden we're talking about enslaved people and we're talking about Black women, and what you see is very different. It's counter, right, to the images that are on the page. So what's the legacy of all of this, right? In this nation, Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications than white women. The stats for Philadelphia are actually higher, right? When I had my book published, I was living in Brooklyn. Those numbers were, and that was just in 2017, 2018. 8 times higher, right? So what we have to do, right, at least for those of us who are committed to education, is letting folk know that the patient blaming, these kinds of narratives around, Black women and birthing people not caring about their bodies, their health, their babies, just aren't true. What we now know is, in fact, and let me go back, what we now know and what the statistics are showing, like Kelly Hoffman's, and I'll end on another statistic, that it's not about you being born Black or getting pregnant as a Black person. It really is about people having these anti-Black ideas, right? That somehow Black people don't experience pain, Black women don't experience pain, that Black women are fat, they're obese. Oh, that's why they don't come to their appointments, right? And I'm saying the average American woman wears a size 14 and it's steadily inching up to a size 16. That's considered plus size for the average American woman. So how is it that large Black women are being blamed in ways that other women aren't? And then if we think about rural communities, especially where there are no transit systems, if people may not own cars, there are all kinds of social influences that can impact the ways that people are interacting with the medical system. And so it gave me a kind of great sense of relief when the CDC finally proclaimed that medical racism was a healthcare issue and it was a crisis, right? David Satcher had been trying to do that work since the 1990s under the Clinton administration. And so it took Fauci and the CDC in the midst of a COVID pandemic to finally proclaim, because of the health disparities and the numbers that you couldn't deny, that in fact it was medical racism and not just race, which had been used, I think, in my estimation, really inaccurately. So I typically would end on a kind of sad note, but I wanted to show the ways that Black women especially are reclaiming historical narratives, how they're using history, right, to be able to tell, to have a retelling, really. And so I think about Michelle Browder's monument to Sims's enslaved patients that she terms the mothers of gynecology, right? And so she has the figures of Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy, the names of the 3 enslaved women who were part of that surgical team that assisted Sims as he was trying to, come up with a successful surgical reparative method. Oh, this is also the good news. Michelle Browder, a daughter of Montgomery, Alabama, bought the Sims Hospital almost a year ago. You can go to her website, and she is now going to use it as a educational institution, a cultural institution, but also a clinic, because Alabama only has 1 Black midwife. And so once again, here she is literally reclaiming the history by purchasing the Sims Hospital. Kimberly Seals Allers, the founder of the Earth app and also Black Breastfeeding Week. The Earth app, she dropped the B for bias, right? Birth without bias. But there were not a lot of data programs that could track Black and brown women's experiences with doctors. And so she set this up. You can download it on your Android or your, on any smartphone or your Apple phone. And so she's able to do that, right? Even has a best-selling book that was a New York Times bestseller around the Black birthing experience. And then also I think about folk like Rachel Hardiman. She's a Black public health scholar at the University of Minnesota School of Public Health, one of the best in the nation. She and 3 other researchers combed through almost 2 million Florida hospital births from the late 20th century, so 1992, all the way to 2015. And they were looking for clues about births and racism. And what they found with this hospital, right, in Florida, or several hospitals in Florida, Black newborns are 3 times as likely to die as white newborns, when Black babies as likely to die as white newborns. I think I might have put that wrong. Not as likely to die, as white newborns when they're cared for by Black doctors after birth. So literally, and this is from a Washington Post article, when you have Black clinicians, and doesn't matter what kind, right? Pediatricians, OBGYNs, neonatologists, family practitioners, the mortality rate was cut in half. The same is true for Black birthing people as well. So what we're finding is when Black patients are dealing with Black practitioners, so whether it's a lactation specialist or a nurse, right, a pediatric nurse, right, those stats around mortality and morbidity are cut by over 50%. And so I'll end here because I'm 3 minutes over. So I'm, instead of 30 minutes, I'm kind of moving into 35. But I'll end here by saying, there is a real thirst from the public around trying to understand the history of this. I know because I am constantly booked, for talks with every sector of our nation, from schools, organizations, community groups, you name it. I've given all kinds of talks around this. So there is a real desire by people to understand this, but also you'll have to do the hard work, right? Sometimes you will have to state things that are unpopular, that people don't want to embrace in order to do good history. And then the other thing is, we don't necessarily have to recreate an archive. And by that, what I mean is the archival records already existed for me. What I simply needed to do was read them differently. And so instead of reading them simply from the positionality of the doctors, right, or the owners, I read them from the experiences of enslaved women. And I was able to get another kind of story. I was able to extract different kind of information, which allowed me to be able to tell another version of American history of medicine and slavery. And so I thank you for your time and attention, and I welcome your comments and your questions.
Thank you so much, Deirdre. We do have one question from ML, which is, have you found any instances where Black bodies are appreciated and or praised in the history of gynecology or medicine more broadly?
Yeah, thank you so much for that, ML. What I found is nowadays, thanks to those literary critics and theorists of the 1990s, every historian now feels like, we have to theorize. So I had to come up with something, right? And so I came up with this term that I call medical superbodies. So on one hand, you can say these are inferior people. They live in a state of arrested development, intellectually, physically, blah, blah, blah. And then at the same time say, oh my God, they're so strong. They're so courageous and brave. And so you find these records where literally, people will praise these women and say, they were so strong during surgery, or, they're like children. They don't have any sense of pain. They don't have any fear. And so even in that praising of Black bodies, and I have a few examples of those in my book, it's still, it's still couched in these ways of making Black people's bodies and experiences as exceptional and not human. But that's a great question. Thank you.
We've got another question. I'm wondering how these histories intersect with histories of Black women in nursing, thinking about figures like Mary Jane Seacole, but also countless enslaved Black women who must have delivered care.
Yeah. Thank you for that, E. Berry. That's a wonderful question. They intersect because what I wanted to show was, and I remember kind of getting in trouble with my editorial team at at the University Press, because they kept saying, you're overselling, the contributions of these enslaved women, because I wanted the book to not be called Medical Bondage, but Mothers of Gynecology. And what I'm saying is, Sims didn't do this by himself. He had surgical assistants. He had a team. Rarely is the case where we find someone kind of working by themselves. And so that's the thing. Slavery allows access. And what I found from my, kind of archival digging, especially for a lot of the larger plantations, many of the women who become nurses later, or midwives, had suffered from certain conditions. And so they are then brought into a space where they go through a kind of what we would call an informal apprenticeship program. And so I literally saw that happening. And so I don't know what happens to all of these women once they're released back to their owners. But one would suspect, based on my archival research, that with this new knowledge they attained, in fact, knowledge that no one else had except Sims and them, right? Until he starts to teach it and he starts to write about it, that they probably did some kind of healing work. And just like you said, these countless enslaved Black women, we don't know their names, right? That's the thing that has been kind of lost in the historical record. But they were certainly relied upon for the nursing work that they did. So thank you for that question.
There's another question. We've got another question about whether there are devices or standards in the OBGYN context which have racism baked into them, like for example, the spirometer.
Ooh, not, so that's the thing. It's kind of hard just to say OBGYN, right? The standards are basically that that Black women don't necessarily experience pain. I mean, I think that's probably the most common. But I would say kind of throughout the medical field, one of them is for kidney disease. And my God, this is going to show that I write about dead people and not necessarily living people, right? That I write about people who lived centuries ago. But I want to look on my phone, but I also want to pay attention to you. But and someone can put it in the chat. It is the, I think is it MFR? I can't remember, but it's like the kidney readings where essentially we know that there is a kind of negotiation that's used with readings and testing that then says, oh, Black people have higher rates of kidney disease or kidney malfunctions. And it simply isn't true. Right. There are all kinds of ways. I remember giving a keynote to a group of GFR. Thank you. I knew somebody, Quazon. Thank you so much. GFR. I said MFR, GFR. And you all can Google that. I mean, people are finally starting to talk about this. Another thing. Oh, so I have two more pediatrics. There's something called the wimpy white boy syndrome. And people are like, what? When I talked to all of the pediatric doctors and nurses, they were like, oh, yeah, we've heard of it. And so there's this belief that when newborns come into the world, that newborn white male infants have less of a chance of survival. So guess what doctors have done? They do the things that they need to intervene to save these children's lives. Well, what we realize is, so there's this belief that somehow biologically or genetically, white male newborn infants are weaker, hence wimpy white boy syndrome. This is the thing, though. What we're finding, the mortality rates are higher for Black newborn infants. Guess what? It's not anything genetic. It's because the interventions are not being made in the same ways that they are for white males. And then this is the really interesting thing for me. Black women and birthing people have been blamed for every negative medical outcome regarding their bodies and their children's bodies. I grew up in the 1980s. Remember the crack epidemic? And guess who was blamed? Crack mamas, right? These women were going out here smoking crack and they were going to topple our economy. And then, of course, 25 years later, we found out none of it was true, right? That these children didn't suffer any long-term sustained damage. So my question to the pediatricians and nurses were, have you all done articles and research to blame white mothers for their behaviors for creating these wimpy white newborns? They hadn't even thought about it. Now, this is the thing. I say that tongue, placed firmly in cheek. I don't want that to happen. But they hadn't even thought that a white mother or birthing person could have been pathological, could have been criminal. The assumption was, oh God, these poor babies, they're just weak. We must help them. And yet Black women and birthing people have been blamed since the days of slavery for every negative medical outcome regarding their pregnancy and birth. So you know what, actually, I'll just stop there because it's numerous examples. So thank you for that.
Does the VBAC calculator kind of fit into that?
Oh my God, yes, the VBAC too. Because once again, what we also know is a lot of the populations were not diverse populations. They tended to be very homogenous populations as well. And I mean, and when I say homogenous, in lots of ways, from class, all of these things. What we do know about medical racism, though, in the ways that it affects Black women and birthing people, is that none of the factors help Black women. So you can be none of the factors that help other people. Relationship status. Typically, if you're partnered, if you're middle class, if you're educated, and by that I mean college degree or higher, typically those things can act as buffers because you have access to more resources, right? To income home. If you're middle class, you live in areas that don't have food deserts. I mean, all of those kinds of things. Better hospitals. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. In fact, the group that has more risk for pregnancy complications and births are Black women like me, Black women who hold PhDs. We're at more risk for pregnancy complications and death than any other group of Black women. So that doesn't even protect you.
Another question is when scholars speak of medical racism, do they also include other structural inequality like access to nutrition and healthcare systems in the understanding of the concept?
Yes, they do. And in particular, I think the folk who have been the most vocal and I think have done a much more better job than historians who are kind of jumping on the bandwagon, public health scholars and advocates have been doing this work for a mighty long time. So they've been ahead of the curve. So yes, they do. And they're talking about it all from the environment, nutrition, access to mental health care. I mean, everything, transportation, carbon footprints, you name it. It's as diverse as, any of the factors that we can all think of in this virtual space. So yeah, public health practitioners are really doing the good work of writing articles about that.
I think those are all the questions in the comments. I just have one last question, which I was thinking about that Hoffman pain bias study, and I know that you have talked about being really in demand, and I know that you've talked to, I think, medical students and residents. What reactions do you get from them when they hear about this study?
This is an interesting thing. So I remember I was on a panel with Harriet Washington, who wrote Medical Apartheid in 2008. And my book came out in 2017. So almost 10 years later, we've had vastly different reactions and responses. She was castigated. People were unaccepting. It's been the very opposite because almost 10 years had passed, right? So in many ways, I'm preaching to the choir. These are folk who they can't argue against the stats. And because you have people like Hoffman, people like Rachel Hardiman, all of these public health folk, practitioners who are coming out and speaking about the consistency of medical racism, the persistence of it, that they are saying, no, let us be clear with our language. This is not about people who don't care about their bodies. Donna Iene Davis, a wonderful ethicist who writes about reproductive injustice, and she looks at middle class Black women and birthing people and their experiences. There's so many books and articles that I have been really accepted. So I've done a lot of joint ventures. I'm not going to say most proud because I've done some really great work with medical organizations and hospitals, but Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, right down the street from on Locust, right down the street from the library company, I was able to do a lot of work with them around learning modules. This is Sims's alma mater, where Sims gained his MD, right? And so to be able to do work that is important to me as a historian, but also has real meaning for the world that we live in today. It really warmed my heart. I was able to do work with the ACNM, so that's a organization of nurse midwives, ACOG, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecology, even help Congress with fact finding around health disparities. And, a 15-minute conversation literally turned out to be a talk very similar to this, because I was like, you're not going to get me to talk about 400 years of slavery. I was like, in 15 minutes, y'all better get out your notepads. And so it was great, though, to be able to know that, this kind of work, so for grad students here, You can be sitting in your archives by yourself wondering, will anybody read this work? Does this matter? It does matter. It matters because it helps to move us forward and hopefully not have us repeat some of this, just some of the mistakes that we know are harmful to our bodies, to our society, to humanity. So this is why history is important.
I completely agree. We have one last one last question, which is, what do you think of the role of pedagogy for medical and other practitioners? I think social determinants of health is more common now, but not always historical.
Yes, I don't know. Is that Rohini Patel? I don't know if you're a medical practitioner or not, but if you are, what I would say is make sure that the kinds of courses that are a bit more humanistic or social science are not just electives. So that's the thing when I've done, especially grand rounds for OBGYNs, I've not given a grand round, and I've done it from Mount Sinai, what's it, Weill Cornell, every hospital you can think of. Every last one of those OBGYNs are like, I never learned this in grad school. I never learned this in grad school. Robert Wood Johnson. I mean, I can think of all the schools. And so for me, I'm thinking, how do you not know this? I mean, for some of them, they were shocked to know that race wasn't a biological construct. The very thing that as people in the humanities and social scientists that we kind of take for granted, everybody's not on the same page. So make sure that the curriculum, and I do a lot of consulting around curriculum development and design, make sure that the curriculum also includes books by social scientists, especially in sociology, public health folk, but also folk who do the humanities, because I think a lot of the work that we're doing around race and racism is really important and needs to be read outside of the kinds of spaces, like this space, or universities, that they can be diversified.
All right. I think that's probably it for questions. I want to thank Deirdre Cooper Owens again so much for being here. And for everyone else, please join us next month on February 21st for a talk with Subhadra Das, who we also interviewed for the new season of the podcast. And then for more from the Science History Institute, including updates on all of our programs and events, you can check out our website and follow us online at scihistory.org. Sorry, you can follow, our website is sciencehistory.org, and then our handles on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram is scihistory.org. And you can also check out our YouTube channel where you'll find this talk and also previous talks. And you can subscribe to the channel. So thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.